Okay, here we go. Our next talk is Bigfoot Skeptics, Abominable Science. Abominable Science. Your moderator is going to be Blake Smith. He, of course, is the host of the Monster Talk podcast, which you have to check out. It's so much fun. Here is the haiku. Lonely Yeti sits, pining for Bigfoot's agent, needs to get more gigs. Please welcome Blake Smith.
Thank you. Good morning. It's wonderful to be here at the amazing meeting. I think you've probably heard some really interesting stories so far if you've been attending the sessions on miracles and frauds and all kinds of fake medicine and misguided attempts at science. But today we get really amazing because we're going to talk about monsters. So, which is what I'm sure many of you have been waiting for. Our panel today includes Sharon Hill, who does the Doubtful News website, and she's a HuffPo contributor. We've got Daniel Loxton, who does Junior Skeptic. He has written many children's books, including a fascinating one on evolution that I think is great for any kid. He also is the co-author of this book, Abominable Science. Don Prothero as well, who's written 2 books in backstage here just now, and many others, who's a paleontologist and just a wonderful guy. They're actually here, we're promoting this book, Abominable Science. I have probably more than 200 paranormal topic books in my book collection, and this is by far the most well-cited and well-put-together and beautiful book on cryptozoology that I've ever seen in my life. If you don't buy a copy, you're missing out. I just want to say that. This is wonderful. To begin this talk, we're going to let Don do a short presentation that's going to sort of set the tone for this, and without further ado, Don Prothero.
Thanks so much. Karen Stolznow, as you saw, was on the program. She's in the middle of a deadline, right in the middle of our meeting. So you saw her running around. She's upstairs editing right now, sad to say. As Blake very nicely said, we have a new book out. Daniel and I will be out there signing it after this and several more times this afternoon when there are breaks, if you're interested. It's a 4-year labor on our part, actually more than that. In Daniel's case, he's been working on this most of his life. And it brings together a collaboration of Daniel, who's been an amateur cryptozoologist to start as a child and then grew into a skeptic as an adult. And my own component of it is a kid who grew up with dinosaurs at age 4 and never matured. And now coming at it as a scientist, a paleontologist with background in areas relevant to cryptozoology. So what we tried to do in this was not just talk about one particular type of cryptid like Bigfoot or others. There's actually 5 in there that we dealt with at length, and 2 more we had to leave out because of length. But to talk about the scientific method and how it works, and in particular how the scientific method is important in this context of what we have dealt with for decades now with these cryptozoology hunters and so on. And one of the first things you'll find, of course, is when you deal with it, that they have the evidence ranking all backwards, right? The evidence that they value the most and what most crypto hunters are crazy about is what they themselves experience, personal experience or anecdotes of other people who claim to have seen Bigfoot. And as those of you who know come to this amazing meeting more often than not, there's lots of problems with that, which I'll mention in a second. So you'll see there on the slide, it's better to think of things in terms of what scientists consider good evidence and not such good evidence. The best possible course, if it ever happens, which I'm not putting any money on in Vegas or anywhere else, is actual physical remains, something that is more than just just the usual, a bone, a skeleton, a tooth, or even better still, a carcass or a live animal, all of which have never been obtained. Then, of course, the sliding scale down goes really fast. So there are lots of videos, there are lots of stuff out there, but as all of you know in this business, videos and photographs are extremely easy to fake, and now most kids can do Photoshop well enough to do themselves. And then there's the crummiest evidence, stuff that you can make up real easy, as people have done for decades, from footprints and all the rest, which can be faked so easily. And then, certainly in my personal view, the worst possible evidence is personal experience, which is the reverse of what cryptozoologists do, because we all know, if you've been to these meetings, we are great at deceiving ourselves. We have all sorts of ways in which our mind sees things that aren't there or plants things in there that we want to believe are there. We know not to trust eyewitness testimony. The legal profession is gradually reaching that point where they too no longer take eyewitness testimony as much as they used to, thanks to people like Elizabeth Loftus and others who have been at this meeting before explaining how easily it can go wrong. Many of you have seen the famous video that I didn't want to put the link in here for time reasons, the famous gorilla and the basketball video, where you're forced to concentrate on a team of two basketball teams throwing a basketball back and forth, and you're asked to count how many times the white shirt team passes the basketball. And if you do that properly and focus just on what they're doing, you do not see a gorilla walk right through the shot. Okay? If you know that's coming, of course, I've ruined it for you. But in any case, that's a classic example of attention disorders that you can easily miss things. Two examples that we put in the book here of classic cases where eyewitnesses turned to be very wrong, in this case tragically wrong. A famous case in 2004 where a hunter saw, he was out hunting hogs, he saw something moving in the distance, someone called out hog, he took a shot at it, it was actually the good toboggan cap his son was wearing, and he killed his own son. And then the famous, suppose you remember this case from 2002, the famous DC sniper. Police were given leads to look for a white van with white shooters, and they actually caught these guys several times in various types of roadblocks and let them go because they were looking for white shooters and a white van. It turned out to be two black guys in a blue sedan. These are kinds of things where eyewitnesses just basically give us nothing to go on. And then, of course, the long record of things like people who say they saw something, and then when you actually have a way of checking it, they put in memories that were not there. Lots of ways in which, as long as you watch what happens here, you'll see that we can easily deceive ourselves, and we often don't realize we're doing it. Plus, when you're dealing with, say, with a cryptid like the Mokele Bambembe in Africa, there's different standards of what's real and not real if you're in a different culture. And for many cultures, mythological features, things they've seen in hallucinations are just as real to them as what we would call real. And we cannot necessarily take their idea of reality at face value when we're talking about ours. So you have to be very careful. These things are very slippery, and yet this is what cryptozoologists dwell upon, the largest point. I won't say much about the definition of cryptozoology. It's basically, yes, we're discovering new animals all the time, but they're usually fairly conventional animals. They're a new species of cattle, or a new species of peccary, or a new species of monkey or bird, which most people wouldn't consider that startling. The last really startling animals to be found were found better than a century ago. The mountain gorilla in 1901, the Komodo dragon in 1912, the okapi in 1901. There were things found since then, like the kukri and the chakwan peccary. Nobody would have noticed they were different until a zoologist actually looked. So that one of the things you'll hear cryptozoologists say, and this is a good point to discuss if you're interested, oh, well, like, for example, the coelacanth wasn't found until 1938. Well, now the deep sea is a different game, right? The deep sea has lots of things we haven't yet found. But talking about the animals that are normally part of cryptozoology, they're air-breathing, either land creatures or air-breathing sea creatures. That's a totally different game altogether, and it's not a fair comparison. Plus, the coelacanth lives extremely deep waters and in places of the world where not a lot of fishing had been done until they were found. Now, one of the things that's really surprising and really interesting about this, especially if you follow it over time, which is one of the things that we do in our book, is talk about how these myths have grown over time and been propagated over time, is that they tended to be much more believable and much more common in the old days. And what we're seeing now is a sort of a law of diminishing returns. We're getting fewer and fewer sightings that make any sense, and in many cases the sightings are dropping off quite a bit. And you can do this in zoology. It's basically like a law of diminishing returns. How many new species you expect to find given certain constraints? So the plot you see there on the bottom of the screen, knowing that the discovery curve of new species every year, which is that ascending curve you see in the left half of the plot, those plots almost always taper off and come to pretty much a flat slope at the very top. Because at some point you really pretty much reach a point where there's not much in the way of new things to discover. And this has been done in a number of different large animal groups. Okay, and it's seen very effectively, especially in the parts that Daniel worked on in our book, where he looked at the cultural effects, how much cryptozoology is pretty much dictated by whatever copycat phenomenon you want to dictate. So Daniel shows very effectively that probably the modern version of the Loch Ness Monster was inspired by King Kong. For those who know the original King Kong with the early stop motion animation, there is a sea creature in there that pretty much is a dead ringer for what Nessie became the year later. And so there's a very strong line of evidence that Daniel points out nicely that King Kong probably spawned the Loch Ness Monster. Take that as your take-home line. Another example, which we're not able to include in the book, the legend of the Chupacabra from Central and South America, Latin America. As Ben Radford is not here at this meeting is able to show, it comes from one lady who watched the movie Species with Natasha Henstridge, where she goes from being a beautiful woman to a strange creature, and the monster Syl in that thing looks just like her hallucination of Chupacabra. And then Chupacabra was spread all over the Latin world almost within a year or two, instantaneously. And then especially after the famous Christina show, Christina is like the Oprah of the Latin world, when it was on her show, all of a sudden Chupacabra was in every country in Central and South America. Very non-biological pattern. Now, something else that's commonly part of the cryptozoology mythology is this idea that there's so much left to find in the land. The world is unexplored. And when the pioneers of cryptozoology, Ivan Sanderson, who was a genuine zoologist and did roam the jungles, started their careers, that might have been true. But the world of inaccessible, unknown regions is changing very rapidly. In fact, it's changed in a way that's probably never conceivable. If you've ever traveled the Pacific Northwest, one of the things that strikes you, and no matter how well the logging companies try to hide it, is that how much of the Pacific Northwest has been logged and logged and logged. So on the bottom picture there, just a handful of these shots you can get from just low-angle aerial views of clear cutting. The forest is nothing like it was when supposedly Bigfoot was first roaming around. In fact, my co-author Daniel spent his childhood as a shepherd in these clear-cut areas. So they're very common, and it really represents very much less forest than most people give it credit for. Or think about what's going on now with satellite imagery. You can click on Google Earth, and you can see better than any generation ever in the past could see, down to resolution the size of a meter or so in most cases. You can look for Mokele Mbembe or Bigfoot yourself from satellite. Okay, it's that easy to see it from space, and I show an image there from Google Earth that I captured, and the references are in the book if you want to look it up yourself. You can see elephants from space easily, okay, and Mokele Mbembe is supposed to be bigger. All right, so this is the kind of thing that's seldom mentioned, but it's actually quite easy now to really follow the world, and you can do it from your laptop. And the other point coming with this, and how much this world is actually seen by people who are not cryptozoologists, real biologists travel through Africa, and they travel through the forests in North America all the time. They really know they're wild animals, and they're not the ones who report Bigfoot. It's people who are amateurs about biology wandering around, and every strange sound they don't recognize is Bigfoot. And I love this little cartoon. It just appeared online a week ago, so I stuck it in at the last minute. You'll see the top caption there, percentage of U.S. population carrying cameras everywhere they go, every waking moment of their lives. And then you see in the bottom, in the last few years, with very little fanfare, we've conclusively settled the question of flying saucers, lake monsters, ghosts, and Bigfoot. That's really, to me, one of the most powerful things. There's a rumor going around, I don't know if it's true or not, that Spielberg himself said he no longer believes in UFOs, and it's because everyone has a cell camera. Now, I put into this book mostly my professional training as a biologist and a geologist. I had to do both to become a paleontologist. And as biologists especially, we know a lot of things about animal populations, maybe not known at the time of Ivan Sanderson or the early pioneers of cryptozoology, certainly known right now. And it's inexcusable that people who actually think they're doing biology don't know these things and shouldn't be paying attention to them. But there are lots of things that, occasionally hear these mentioned, but they don't often get put together in a framework of what a field ecologist, for example, thinks of routinely and trained to think of. For example, first of all, every cryptid is not a singleton, right? The Loch Ness Monster, or there is not one Bigfoot that lived forever, right? They've got to be a population. And the more you see of them, the bigger the population has to be. And you never run into this thinking, well, why are we never seeing two Bigfoot together? Okay, you never run into the question, well, why is there not more of these things? The more there are, the more likely we should be seeing good sightings and actual traces. And the exact opposite is the case. And in particular, in biology, it's well known for land mammals especially, larger animals require larger home range to sustain them as biological organisms. There's an actually clear-cut formula there, which I put on the screen if you're interested in the math of it. Very straightforward relationship between body size and how many animals they can sustain in a given area. And you do that calculation, the range area, especially things like Mokele Mbembe and Loch Ness Monster, is not big enough to actually sustain a population of Mokele Mbembe or Loch Ness Monster, okay? And depending on how many Bigfoot you expect to be out there, and every state in the Union has one about once a month, you pretty much can't make that sense either. And most of the lakes in which the lake monsters live are actually not big enough to support a lake monster. Now, as a geologist also in my training, there are many geologic constraints, and one in particular that's really important for all the lake monsters, not just Loch Ness monster, but also Lake Champlain monster, Champy, and Lake, there are many of them, as you know. But the thing that's almost always glossed over or just mentioned briefly and then never really thought about, every single one of those lakes was under a mile of ice 12,000 years ago. And there are 24 separate glaciations in the last 2.5 million years that have covered those lakes repeatedly. And we're talking about a thickness of ice similar to what's on top of Greenland right now. So you have to do some very strange supernatural biology to get organisms in those lakes once the ice melts back. None of those lakes, by the way, have an outlet to the ocean. So unless they're aquatic creatures that can crawl across enormous distances on land to somehow end up in a lake, that pretty much rules out Nessie right there, okay? Along with Champ and all the rest. Simply cannot get those guys out there, unless of course you want your animal frozen and ice, and then you're talking about sci-fi. Which you're pretty much talking about sci-fi. Anyway, and then as a paleontologist, this is something I can speak to directly from my training. Sure, the fossil record isn't perfect, but for large animals, the fossil record is excellent because large animals leave large bones, and they're much more likely to be preserved. So we can much more great confidence say when you don't see a large bone of something, it's almost certainly no longer in existence, at least in the area where we collect them. And in a particular case of, say, Bigfoot, okay, we have an outstanding fossil record of Ice Age and post-Ice Age mammals in North America. Literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of specimens of most species that live in North America. Gigantic collection. I mean, I work at La Brea Tar Pits alone where they have close to 3 million bones, okay? We can be pretty confident, even rare animals are sampled. And we do have a handful of rare Ice Age animals. Not once do we get anything from Bigfoot, or any primate for that matter, anywhere in the last 45 million years in North America. That, I think, is very strong negative evidence. And this is true also in Africa and elsewhere. There's excellent fossil records since, for example, in the case of Mokele Mbembe or the plesiosaur that's supposedly the Loch Ness monster, excellent evidence that both those animals are no longer around after 65 million years from every continent of the world. And that's not weak negative evidence, that's strong negative evidence. So I'll finish then with the point, well, why should we take cryptozoology seriously? And here is where what Daniel and I sort of differ a bit. I really fear that it is a sort of gateway drug to bad thinking and critical sloppiness and so on, anti-scientific thinking. On the lower right there, of your, or lower left of your slide, are the guys who now chase Mokele Mbembe. Some of them also chase Loch Ness Monster. And they're all creationists, okay? The only ones really spending any money or any time anymore chasing the Loch Ness Monster or Mokele Mbembe are creationists. Why do you think they would do this? This is very bizarre. Because they think that somehow if they find a dinosaur in the Congo, all of evolution will be overthrown, which shows you how little they know about evolution, okay? And if you ever saw the series of Monster Quest about Mokele Mbembe, where I was the token skeptic with 3 minutes of time in an hour, the entire rest of the video is this guy William Gibbon and his colleagues blundering around, showing any trained field biologist they were incompetent, doing the exact worst possible way to find the animal they were looking for. And you say, oh, well, yeah, they're creationists, but they only listen to their audience. Well, the lower right slide, if you've heard about it, they're now pushing the idea of promoting the Loch Ness Monster in Louisiana science education, because that is part of the creation's agenda. So there are consequences, in my view. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. That was excellent. I do want to take a moment because Karen wasn't able to be here to remind you that her book, Haunting America, is available for e-download. Excellent book as well. It's an e-book, so it's not as substantial as this, but the content's great, so please give that a shot. So let's just start out our panel with a question that's kind of near and dear to my heart. And I'm going to address this to Daniel, but then we'll go across. With all of these serious, potentially harmful things out there, bad ideas, bad pseudoscience, bad attempts at science that can harm people, why should skeptics be interested in Bigfoot? What's the value of Bigfoot skepticism?
I think there are a number of answers to that. One is pretty obvious, that a lot of people believe in Bigfoot. A lot of people believe in all of these creatures. Belief in Bigfoot is, in the US and Canadian population, around 20% of the population. That's 2 or 3% of people who are definitely convinced, and roughly 17% of people who believe that it's very probably real. That's a lot of people, and when you have an idea that is that prevalent in the population, I think it's worth the time of a few critical specialists to look at that question. I advocate for this kind of skepticism, but I don't insist that every skeptic take up Bigfoot as their personal bugbear. It's just having a handful of specialists, ideally for each of these strange ideas, these pseudoscientific or fringe science ideas. We should have specialists in homeopathy and ufology and monsterology and all kinds of nonsensologies. That's what I think we're doing here. There's also the creationist angle that was just mentioned. Like the Mokele Mbembe, for example, really is a creature of and for and by missionaries. That's really why the legend exists and is propagated at this point. It's funded by fundamentalist creationists, and it's pursued in the hope of bringing down evolution, which, as John mentioned, is a forlorn hope. As sharks and most of the creatures around don't. Crocodiles.
Sharon, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I would agree with Daniel in that there are so many people involved, and if you're involved at all in the community, you'd realize that many of these people are extremely serious and put an enormous amount of time and effort and sometimes money into this serious hobby that they have. And it's interesting, and it grabs the media attention, these stories, no matter how credible they are, the media still loves to put them out there. For me, I have been interested in cryptozoology since I was a kid, and I think that another point to be made is that kids are interested in monsters, and this is a good way to bring kids into the idea of skeptical thinking and critical thinking about, is this real? And I think a lot of us have done that with our own kids and have had success in showing them how to think about this issue and the evidence that is out there. But I think
if I may, that is why so many junior skeptics start with a monster hook. It's kids like monsters.
Yeah, it's a great
and grown-ups.
Yeah,
I mean grown-ups like monsters.
And right now with Bigfoot is huge right now.
He's really big.
So
yes.
big.
Yes, he's very large.
He's all over television, and the media just loves him. And I think what it's portrayed, Search for Bigfoot is portrayed as a scientific endeavor. And a lot of what this book is about shows that it's a really poor representation of how science works. And it's being portrayed as science in these media TV shows like Monster Quest and Finding Bigfoot, and it's just awful. And I do have this concern that kids or adults watching this on TV are thinking that's the way science works, and it's just really bad.
Yeah, I think that hits on a meta issue that television shows in general, which purport to be scientific, have the issue that all that's editorially controlled, even if they have scientists in the content generation, that the editorial control is done by non-scientists. So,
and if you've seen it on TV, it must be real.
Well, yeah, there is a lot of that. No, I have really good friends who are very intelligent who believe that Ghost Hunters is a scientific show. So, yeah.
Or mermaids, yes. Just
well,
last month.
Don't lose track of mermaids. I'm going to come
That's
back
right.
to that.
Yeah, I'll amplify what they both said, but a different thing that's obvious is that the way the media is now fractured, you have this giant race of unfiltered news 24/7 over thousands of different channels, and every possible electronic device you own seems to be a filter for news. And so the sad part is, if it bleeds, it leads. It's always been a standard of journalism. Bigfoot or any monster captures media attention, captures an audience. And the challenge is, hopefully, that one or more of us who are the other side will eventually get our voice heard, so that these guys will at least get, the token skeptic, my 3 minutes in an hour program is better than we usually get, but at least that's the part of the job we're hopefully in position to do. Because otherwise, as Sharon said, it basically creates a false notion of how science works. In her words, it's science-y. They imitate the science trappings without actually really doing the method of science. And we need to get the public in general more aware of what real scientists do and how it doesn't resemble their stuff at all.
I'm soft on monsters, honestly, because I come from monsters. I love this stuff as a kid. I love it now. For me, it's just a continuation of my childhood love of paranormal mysteries. The skeptical work I do is just the same thing, a little bit better. I'm just continuing the same work. It can have a cost. People do get killed doing these kind of monster pursuits. A case recently where someone was run over in the execution of a Bigfoot hoax. There is a human cost. Sometimes lives are destroyed in the vain pursuit of these will-o'-the-wisp kind of legends. But even if there were no cost, these would still be interesting things to study. These paranormal ideas have shaped our culture. Western culture has been shaped by UFOs and Bigfoot, and these are ideas that nonetheless have been largely neglected by other scholarship. So it falls on us to do that work. I think that's useful.
I agree. I think also, from my own perspective, that the world of cryptozoology and paranormal investigation is the world of belief writ small. I mean, each of these beliefs, you'll see the same sort of techniques used to defend them, whether successfully or unsuccessfully, in religious approaches or paranormal approaches or cryptozoological, which theoretically shouldn't be paranormal. But everyone in the audience has the opportunity to get onto the internet and argue for or against any particular claim that comes out. So I guess a question I have is, how should we comport ourselves as skeptics when engaging with people who believe these things? And I'm going to address that to Sharon first. Yeah.
It's your belly would go right.
Yeah. I mean, my philosophy is that I don't want to disparage people's experiences and their beliefs. They have these experiences and they're interpreting them in terms of, say, a Bigfoot encounter. They've had a scary experience out in their backyard or out in the woods or camping, and because of the cultural aspect, they interpret it in terms of this monster. And I can't change their interpretation, and I wasn't there to have their experience either. But they were obviously extremely affected by it and rather scared, and they don't know what to think about it most of the time. So I try to be really sympathetic to their beliefs. As I talked about it in my talk on Friday, I try to be that honest broker and give them some ideas about what could be an alternative. You're dealing with a belief that's so strong that you're not going to be able to undo that with just your commentary. But I try to be fair. People know me as the skeptic, but they also know that I'm not going to call them crazy. I'm not going to say that they're lying, because I don't think either one of those things. I think they've had a personal experience that they've interpreted in their own way, so I'm trying to be sympathetic to that. It doesn't always work. There are nasty believers just as much as there are nasty debunking skeptics who will brush people off. So you're going to have those extremes in either population, but I just try to be in the middle. It doesn't always work.
I understand. Dan, do you have anything to say about tone?
This is a topic I address quite often, and my approach is just to be professional at all costs, at all times, and empathetic, particularly because, as Sharon just mentioned, a lot of the time, people believe. Well, Sagan said, people are not stupid. They believe things for reasons, and that's true. People don't just, mostly just pick things out of the air. They've had things that shape these beliefs in their lives, and a visceral personal experience is very compelling. If you say Bigfoot, you will believe in Bigfoot, and and that would convince you in this room. You are unlikely to see Bigfoot because you are not set up that way, but many people are, yeah, it's very hard to argue with that kind of thing, and in a way, I don't really have a right to. I was not there. I did not see what you saw. So I try and approach those conversations with transparency about the limits of my knowledge involving the case we're discussing.
Don? Because you actually engage with these people not just online but in real life.
Yeah, every once in a while. I battled creationists far longer, and there's a lot of similarities. In fact, we saw the large, some cases, overlapping populations. And in both cases, you really aren't going to make a lot of headway being the hardcore skeptic. You know these people have a deep-set need to believe something. And this is either a directly religious belief or it's a quasi-religious belief, but it's not something that the reason will easily dissuade them of. So the best you can do is, as we've both said already, is be professional, be clear, point to resources where they can see the other side, try to explain why scientists in this case don't take certain cryptids very seriously, and you really don't have much power beyond that. I mean, we're not going to convert the whole world, and that's a pipe dream. We just do the best we can.
I do have some success in asking those questions, just questioning what these, just questioning, let's say, Bigfoot experts, people who are blogging or writing on the topic, and you just ask them these basic questions, like you could do in any paranormal setting. Just asking them those questions is very revealing, because often they don't have good answers, and you're always thinking about the people on the outside who are just watching and maybe have not made up their mind yet. So you're doing that for them as well.
I think, in my experience, the people who have got a personal experience of having seen something that they can't explain or that they feel was probably a real Bigfoot is much different from someone like myself who hasn't, but has just a general curiosity about the topic. So that it's quite different, the engagement process. I suppose this is analogous to someone who's experienced a miracle versus people who've heard about a miracle. And I think the parallels between religiosity and cryptozoology in the way that the believers believe is the same. I don't really know how else to put it. Matt Crowley, our friend and colleague, says that many Bigfooters treat it as a religion, and I think the indignation that you receive online when you engage with these folks seems disproportionate for how serious the claim would be outside of the context of the conversation. So, and I think a lot of that comes from that kind of a situation. So this understream of cryptozoology and creationism being mixed together, I was aware of it before I started Monster Talk, but it just keeps coming up again and again and again. So I was going to ask, why won't Michele Mbembe disprove evolution? But I'm going to change that question. And I'm going to say, what cryptid would best disprove evolution? Don. Okay.
There's a famous quote, I think it was to Haldane or someone saying, what kind of thing would disprove evolution, the fossil record? And the answer is along the line, a fossil horse in the Cambrian. It's not that animals could live, past when we think they're extinct, because we know that does happen. It just makes us twist our story a little differently when we discover they did not, in fact, go extinct. But what really is crucial to our understanding of evolution and our confidence that it's real is that the fossil record has a very clear-cut sequence of animals through time. And if there were something really remarkable that was unquestionably in place, not something that accidentally introduced or some kind of hoax, that would be indeed a true falsification of at least part of our understanding of evolution. That's not what they're talking about here.
So you're saying mermaids, right?
Yeah,
mermaids would be very interesting. They violate all sorts of biological laws, yes.
I would also add a good example, a recent example, is the Ketchum interpretation of the DNA.
I was actually about to ask you about that.
Okay. The interpretation of the DNA, you should have an animal that fits into our existing scheme of things.
What DNA is this? Should we introduce?
Yeah, let me back up. So recently, I think there's always been an issue of anecdotal evidence versus hard scientifically evaluatable evidence in cryptozoology. And so up until this recent DNA study, hair samples and prints are really the best evidence that's been available, and some grainy photographs in one amazingly confusing movie. But this DNA study had been, there were rumors that someone had DNA and they were going to be doing a real scientific study. Sharon, how did that play out?
Oh gosh, not very well. A good example of how not to do science and what science is not, I think. She did, a veterinarian, Dr. Melba Ketchum, she did collect many samples from across the country. They were sent to her, and she ran them through a DNA test, and the results, it's way too long a story to talk about, so I'm not going to really talk about the details, but the end result is that she came out with a result that showed that Bigfoot would be a hybrid between some ancestral primate, unknown, I guess proto-Bigfoot, whatever, and then a female human. The DNA ended up looking like bits and pieces of different DNA all mixed together, panda, opossum, all sorts of animals, and bits of human off the certain chromosome. And it's exactly what you would expect if it was a mixture of pieces of DNA that had been degraded out in the environment. Her interpretation was that it's a whole new animal, it's a whole new thing. However, if you find a whole new animal, it should fit into the pattern of evolution that we already know about. It should fit into the DNA database in a way that makes sense. This did not in any way.
So you're saying primates don't become marsupials later, if I'm understanding you right. Is that right?
Yeah, opossum
You're on the
DNA
right
was
track,
part of it,
yeah.
yes.
But Bigfoot do fall asleep if you scare them? I'm not sure.
Plague. I'd rather the puns, okay?
Yeah. Okay, I got it. All right.
So yeah, it eventually came out that she made believe that Bigfoot are the Nephilim, the angels.
Yep.
that were. She's very religious. Again, we've got this religious theme going through this conversation, and it just gets weird, and it just doesn't fit into what we know.
It did play out. It was a big disappointment, I think, for everyone who wanted to see DNA thoroughly evaluated. Although there is another DNA study going on that's still it's in process right now.
Right. That's Todd Sykes. He's working on Todd Sykes. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Working in the UK, collecting samples from all across the world, I think.
Yeah.
And he actually does have a bit more credibility to do such a study than Dr. Ketchum did.
I think he has a good reputation, I think, and
Yes.
it'll be interesting to see how this plays out as a comparison.
Yes, it will
So
be.
I'm anxious to hear the results to that. So, can cryptozoology be science? Don?
Yeah, this is something Daniel and I both put in at length in the final chapter of the book. The problem is that cryptozoology has almost always come from amateur, interests, enthusiasts, which is not bad because amateurs do contribute to many areas of science. But to do science right, there is a scientific method. And then one of the key things in scientific method is we try to be very careful about things like data collection, about how we analyze samples, if possible, run a third sample or a blind or something like that so you don't know what you're doing, which of course Ketchum didn't do. And try as best you can not to fool yourself, I guess is the famous quotation from Richard Feynman. These people, of course, want to believe anything that they find that confirms their viewpoint, of course, not anything else. And the scientist is not in that game. The scientist has to face the evidence, and if it goes against what he or she already thinks, an honest scientist has got to change their mind. An honest scientist has to recognize that something is not what they thought it was. And that's one of the first places we see this failure of scientific method. It doesn't matter what evidence is out there, it will always fit their viewpoint as Bigfoot is real or whatever. And then there's a whole series of other things basic to science. But the biggest problem, and Daniel pointed this out again and again, is there's a tendency in the crypto literature to just pile on story after story after story with no real attempt to weed out what's good and what's bad. Even when they themselves have committed, okay, well, this study was obviously a hoax. It shows up again in the next paper as if they never learned anything. And this is the same way the creationists are. They won't correct mistakes. And that's a serious issue. Scientists are not allowed to get away with that. I'll let Daniel pick up that theme, actually.
There is this creationist thread that runs through cryptozoology, which we discuss in the book, which is otherwise not discussed very much in the literature. And that is part of the kind of the fabric of cryptozoology. But one of the things that makes cryptozoology fun is that it can be scientific. the basic project of cryptozoology is, it goes with the ethos of science. They're trying to find evidence. You don't have to, you don't have to overturn the laws of physics for Bigfoot to be real. You just have to find Bigfoot, and and you can do that using ordinary kind of scientific means. A big net maybe. So yeah, it is fun, but it's also extremely primitive and likely to remain that way because it's not fruitful. So it doesn't really invite that much serious scientific interest. It did previously. There has been a kind of a scientific history of monsterology. In the 19th century especially, there was very serious interest in sea serpents, which we discuss in the book. But because it doesn't go anywhere, it is left largely in the hands of amateurs. And they, as Don mentioned, have the critical problem of never, ever, ever cutting the bad apples out of their... Well, Bigfooters love to talk about the Bigfoot database, the sighting database. Go to the primary evidence, they're always shouting at the skeptics. But, it's not a database, it's just a big, messy pile. And everybody knows that there's a ton of hoaxes in there, a lot of complete baloney. And if you press cryptozoologists on this, they will sometimes admit that as many as 90% of, and ufologists will say the same thing about their database. As many as 90% of the cases, the sighting cases and footprint cases are baloney. But they don't know which ones, and the literature never makes any effort to find out. It just keeps piling. And so as long as that's true, cryptozoology will never advance as a scientific pursuit, although it could.
I studied amateur paranormal investigators, and in that group I included cryptozoologists along with ghost hunters and UFO chasers. And I asked, what I did was I looked at see how they used the word science in their portrayal and their methodology, and it was very poor. They used it about more than half the time in my survey, but the way they used it was incorrect or very weak, or as Susan Hack talked about yesterday, as an honorific way of making it sound good. And one thing I noticed was that not many of them were scientists or had scientific training. Computer science doesn't count.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah. But oh yes, I have computer science.
Them's fighting words.
I'm just clarifying. And one thing I noticed in the way that they approached this is that the approach was wrong. The question maybe is not about cryptozoology, about a cryptid. It's what happened, if anything, in this situation where somebody says they had this experience. So the paranormal investigators of whatever type go into these investigations thinking, I'm going to find evidence for X, paranormal, cryptid, whatever. No, the question is, what, if anything, happened here? And they start off immediately by narrowing their options and going down that path, which is the wrong path.
Yeah.
You go to Ben Radford's book on scientific paranormal investigations, and it shows you that that's not the way you should approach these problems if you really want the answer. And so I get this feeling that the cryptozoologists, as well as the ghost hunters, are particularly bad at this, are looking for a particular answer. It's sham inquiry. It's putting the answer before the evidence and looking for the evidence to fit the answer.
Well, in astronomy, there's a really robust body of amateur astronomers who contribute to the science. So why aren't there amateur naturalists who are working in cryptozoology contributing to the body of work? Or wait, are there? Aren't you one?
I suppose I am.
Yeah.
Except he hasn't traveled in the woods anymore looking for it.
But seriously, yeah, it just seems like there's a lot of there's no pressure for an improvement in the body of written work anyway.
Well, I mean, with in fields where there is the structure of like a core of professional academics and then a larger body of serious amateur practitioners, there is a core of academics, and cryptozoology largely doesn't have that. I mean, it has occasionally invited interest, it has occasionally attracted interest from individual academics who have some kind of relevant training, but there is no community of serious scientists.
Anybody
and
could be a
scholars.
cryptozoologist.
Oh yeah,
You just,
you're
I know,
all
I was called a
cryptozoologists.
cryptozoologist. And
There's not even, I mean, there's not even a well-publicized guidance on how to collect evidence safely. There's nothing.
No.
Yeah, so
They had that at one time too, as Daniel mentioned. People like Roy Mackal and so on were actual PhDs in fields sort of cryptozoology, but Roy Mackal was a microbiologist, and that he was spending all his time chasing Mogelli and plesiosaurs in Loch Ness, which are not the same thing. Okay, a biology degree is not a universal passport to do anything. And that was a problem. They had academics with a handful of them with really inappropriate training, which made them just amateurs effectively. And most of that core of the people who used to take cryptozoology seriously among professionals is all passed on now. Their journal has gone extinct. It's almost 100% amateurs now.
I think I should take a moment here to plug Brian Riegel's book because it ties into that topic really well. So if you get a chance to look at Brian Riegel's book on crackpots.
Searching for Sasquatch.
Eggheads and crackpots.
Yeah,
I think
eggheads
is
and
the
crackpots.
subtitle.
If you look for eggheads and crackpots, Brian Riegel, you'll find it. It's a great, really detailed overview. I think this book has more citations, though. You should get this one.
Heavier citations, too.
So he has a lot of citations. But you've got him beat in size anyway. So
that was one of the things that bugged me. You talk about stories after stories. You go to the popular cryptozoology literature, like the stuff that's found in the library for like middle school kids, and you just pick it up and it's the same recycled stories over and over again, and there isn't one citation in the whole book.
No, and this another problem is, as you've alluded to, things that have already been thoroughly disproven continue to be promoted as though real. And that's, on Monster Talk, we call that the echo chamber of paranormal literature, but it's true for cryptozoology as well.
And true creationism, too. Their arguments never change after 50 years.
So, and I think one of the best things about science is you continuously try to find out what's wrong and then remove that from the body. So, yeah, that's a real issue with the whole topic. But hopefully you'll listen to Monster Talk and find out what's going on next. We have time for some questions.
Sure.
So what do I need to do to make that happen, George?
A little bit of time. Let's form a line, please, if we could, real quick. Number one right here. Here we go.
Hi, Sharon. Hi, guys. They know, but maybe not everyone knows, that I belong to a Bigfoot hunting group called the Bigfoot Club. And I'd like to thank Finding Bigfoot because now they think they need a skeptic.
Nice.
And the fact that I'm a girl helps. But what I found is that we'll come up with ideas, like we spent all winter looking for Bigfoot prints in the snow, very methodically, and I helped them set this up. And I was the only one that found some weird footprints, which disappointed them. But what we don't take into account is how much of a social group it is, how much fun we have saying goodbye to our spouses who are going to go camp in the woods and have fun. And to give that up would be very, very difficult for them. And that's what I found, is that the social atmosphere is so important. So I just wanted to stress
I wanted to join some paranormal investigation groups, but they wouldn't have me, so I was a little bit
It's true. They don't want
so
to
maybe someday. So.
The community aspect is a big part of it. The same reason a lot of churches, hold their people. It's a community. It's more than the dogma. It's about your friends.
Okay. Even if there aren't scientific people going out and looking for your particular cryptozoids, wouldn't people like birders who are out doing surveys of birds, if they saw something that looked like a Bigfoot, wouldn't they report it to somebody? Wouldn't the loggers, I realize they're not scientific, but have any loggers ever reported that while they were clear cutting that they saw something big running away?
If Daniel's the herder, he should tell us.
Well, I mean, that goes to my personal history. I grew up on clear cuts in British Columbia, and I spent my first career as a shepherd working on clear cuts again, far out in the wilderness, up along the BC side of the Alaska Panhandle. We saw some pseudo-Bigfoots, and
What are those?
those are generally stumps.
They have an aqueous counterpart too, don't they?
They do. But yeah, people don't realize how well traveled those areas are. I mean, the entire, the forest of North America is a gridded up commodity. It has been logged and relogged and relogged and regrown and regrown and regrown. The whole thing is civilized. There's wilderness out there, but there are also people out there. So yeah, you would expect a much more robust.
I wanted to comment on that too. There's a huge body of what should have been evidence that hasn't really been studied very much by Bigfooters, I don't think, but that's grizzly bear researchers have hair traps all over the Pacific Northwest and have been doing surveys and studies on those for years and have never reported finding strange, unrecognizable hairs that I'm aware of, and I've been trying to find out. So,
well, there's this kind of basic paradox in cryptozoology that these cryptids seem like plausible possibilities because many people see them, but because many people see them, we should have concrete evidence, and there's just no getting around that tension. It's a problem for cryptozoologists.
Thank you for your question.
From a psychiatrist's point of view, a vexing question that pervades just about every topic of this entire meeting is what are the boundaries between delusion and mere credulity or suggestibility? I could suggest many answers to that question, but I'm much more interested in knowing the panel's point of view.
If someone else says it, it's probably delusion. But if I say it...
Well, and that's part of what science is about. I mean, an individual scientist can believe all sorts of things, and there are many classic cases of individual scientists going off the deep end with some belief system. But in the scientific community, the point is we are self-checking. We have peer review. We have many other ways in which, if you have a solid case, more than one person should be able to see it. And so usually, if there's no evidence beyond the individual claims to see something, it's mostly by peer review that weeds it out. And that's pretty much the way we take that thing.
Oh, and also, I would say there's a really like 3 demarcations within cryptozoology that I'm aware of. And one is they're the natural reality ones, biology inspired people, the paranormalists, and then the creationists. And none of those 3 really like to get along with each other, although they're all interested in the same topic. So that's a true division within the groups.
Oh yeah, I wrote about that. It's called supernatural creep, when their idea of Bigfoot, they can't think of anything natural that would account for certain things, like why he just disappears or why he can't
Although
be
delusion
caught.
does seem...
Yeah. and they end up moving towards supernatural explanations instead. So there's this horrible thing happening.
We got time for one more question.
Okay.
How come most of the cryptids tend to be huge, monstrous creatures rather than small things like 6-legged frogs, which would be much more justifiable in terms of even existing? What is it about the psychology of having these monstrous creatures?
Well, they're that much awesomer.
And they also tend to be like hybrids. Like that, they have a head of a horse and a body of a kangaroo and a tail of a dragon. So they have all these hybrid characteristics, which also goes against evolution. Doesn't make any sense.
And no genetic mechanism whatsoever.
Yeah.
Well, and I think even before the formal study of, if it is formal, of cryptozoology, a lot of these sightings fit into the folklore, and our folklore is full of spectacular monsters and giants in every culture, as far as I can tell. So I think, but there's even thousands of years ago, the story of the 6-legged toad was not very popular.
Daniel, I wrote all about that actually.
Going back to the previous question about belief, there is quite a literature within skepticism, and of course a larger literature within wider psychology about why people believe things. My boss at Skeptic Magazine, Michael Shermer, spent a lot of his career working on this question of why people believe weird things, and in fact why people believe anything. For myself, I know sheep and art and monsters, and
I did a good job.
Yeah. And I can best speak to why I believed in monsters, and in fact I believed in most paranormal things, and that's because they really seemed legit. If you just walk in off the street, they sound pretty good, and that's why I believed it. I had a particular hook in my family history as well, because my parents saw a cryptid called Cadbrosaurus, which is the local Pacific Northwest iteration of the great sea serpent of the North Atlantic. So that was pretty compelling.
I think George is about to shake us off the stage. So Dan, Sharon, Don, thank you so much for being here. Please buy a copy of this book. There's only a few out there. Grab them while they're hot. So, thank you.
Bigfoot panel, thank you so much.